What happens when a soul that feels everything too deeply is trapped in a world ruled by those who feel almost nothing at all? Imagine being born with the ability to sense the hidden pain of others, their loneliness, their shame, their hunger for love, only to discover that some of those people will use that sensitivity as a weapon against you. This is the silent nightmare of the empath who finds themselves surrounded by narcissists. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And what greater darkness could there be than the slow, invisible erosion of your very self when every smile hides manipulation, when every kind word is just bait, and when every embrace feels like a trap? In this video we're going to dive deep into what really happens when empaths collide with narcissists. We'll uncover why this toxic magnetism exists, how it distorts identity, and, most importantly, how Jung's insights reveal a hidden path of transformation buried inside the suffering. By the end, you won't just understand the dance between empath and narcissist, you'll see why enduring it might be the beginning of your own awakening. And if you've ever felt drained, used, or invisible around certain people, then this story isn't just about them. It's about you. Because the truth is, the empath's journey is never just survival, it's an initiation. An initiation into selfhood, boundaries, and the raw discovery of who you truly are when the masks finally fall. So stay with me until the very end, because this isn't just another psychology breakdown, it's a roadmap to freedom, written in the language of shadows, suffering, and rebirth. And before we dive into this journey, let me ask you, have you ever felt like someone's kindness toward you was just a disguise, or that loving them was slowly costing you your soul? If so, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters. This is not just my story, it's our story. They say the empath is born with a radar inside their chest. A radar that picks up emotions others try to bury, sadness behind a forced laugh, despair behind arrogance, hunger behind cruelty. While most people hear only words, the empath feels the tremor beneath them. It's a gift, yes, but when that gift meets the wrong kind of person, it becomes a curse. Because narcissists are not drawn to the empath's light by accident. They are hunters, and empaths radiate exactly what they crave: compassion without limits, forgiveness without end, and attention without resistance. To the narcissist, an empath is not a partner. It's a mirror, a stage, an endless supply of validation to fill their emptiness. And the empath, convinced that love is the medicine, steps willingly into the trap. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone. Many who carry a sensitive heart have walked this invisible battlefield, where love becomes a transaction and kindness becomes a leash. It starts small. A compliment laced with expectation, a favor that becomes obligation, a conversation that leaves you more tired than before. And before you realize it, you are no longer living for yourself. You are living as an extension of someone else's hunger. But here's the truth, this suffering is not meaningless. Carl Jung believed that pain, when faced consciously, is the very crucible that forges transformation. And in the empath's despair, a question begins to rise: am I really helping them, or am I betraying myself? That question is the first crack in the illusion, the first whisper of freedom. So if you've ever felt guilty for saying no, or terrified of being seen as selfish, understand this: you're not broken. You are simply standing at the doorway of your awakening. And the very pain that feels like it's destroying you is also the fire preparing to remake you. At first, the empath bends. They bend because their nature is to give, to soothe, to stretch themselves into the unspoken needs of others. They sense wounds beneath cruelty, loneliness beneath arrogance, hunger beneath manipulation. And in their silent prayer they whisper, if I can just love them enough, maybe they will soften. Maybe they will heal. But the narcissist does not soften. They take and then they take again. And with each act of taking, the empath begins to blur. The boundaries between self and other dissolve until the empath no longer knows where they end and where the other begins. They carry sorrows that aren't theirs, anger that isn't theirs, shame that was never theirs. This is projection in its most intimate form. The narcissist unloading what they cannot bear, and the empath absorbing it as if it belonged to them. And here lies the first wound. The fracture of identity. The empath begins to confuse selflessness with self-erasure, compassion with compliance, empathy with enslavement. They mistake endurance for love, forgetting that love cannot exist where one is devoured and the other enthroned. Yet Carl Jung warned us, the shadow is always present. For the empath, the shadow is not arrogance or cruelty, it is silence. The inability to say no. The terror of being disliked. The hidden rage of being used. The grief of a self abandoned. This is the shadow that calls to be faced. And until it is, the empath's gift will remain a curse. If this feels like your story, hear me clearly. You are not weak. You are not naive. You are standing on the threshold of transformation. The very moment you see your silence as shadow, you are already beginning to awaken. And this is why you must stay with me until the end. Because in this journey, you will discover that the empath's shadow, once faced, becomes their greatest strength. If this message is speaking to you, subscribe now and let me know in the comments. Share your story because your voice is part of this awakening, and others need to hear it. The empath hesitates. To walk away feels like betrayal. To stop giving feels like violence. They believe their love is the medicine, that their endurance is nobility. But here lies the hidden trap. In serving the endless hunger of the narcissist, they betray themselves. They abandon their own soul at the altar of another's void. Carl Jung taught us that suffering, when faced directly, is never wasted. It is the very crucible through which the self whispers, demanding recognition. And so, when the empath reaches the breaking point, when the weight of carrying another's shadows becomes unbearable, something ancient begins to stir within them. A spark. A pulse. A reminder that they are more than a vessel for another's wounds. But freedom does not arrive as a sudden flight. It comes in whispers and subtle awakenings. It comes the first time the empath notices the hollowness of the narcissist's praise. It comes the moment they sense the falseness of the game and no longer wish to play. It comes when they hear, however faintly, the fragile but unmistakable sound of their own inner voice calling them back. This is the beginning of individuation, the path Jung described as becoming who you truly are. Beyond the persona. Beyond the projections. Beyond the mask. For the narcissist, the mask is dazzling, demanding admiration. For the empath, the mask is softer, endlessly giving. But both are masked. Both conceal the deeper truth of the soul. To awaken, the empath must begin peeling away their mask. They must learn that compassion without boundaries is not love but self-destruction. They must learn that saying no can be just as sacred as saying yes. And in this painful learning, something begins to shift. This is the transition, the empath moving from sacrifice into selfhood, from martyrdom into awakening. The old story is ending and a new one is about to begin. The first revelation comes as fire. The empath realizes they cannot save the narcissist. That mission, once their silent religion, dissolves. And in the ashes of that illusion, the gaze begins to turn inward. For the first time, the empath asks not, "What do they need from me?" but, "What do I need for myself?" This shift is small yet seismic. Jung would call it the confrontation with the shadow. Because here the empath must face not only the cruelty of the narcissist, but their own hidden complicity in the dance. The ways they gave away their power, muted their voice, and confused martyrdom with meaning. This recognition burns. It stings to see the ways you abandoned yourself. But in the burning comes purification. Slowly, the empath begins to sense their own outline again, the faint pulse of a self long forgotten. A spark of individuality. A reminder, I exist. I matter. And yet, the journey is not linear. Even as clarity dawns, the echoes of old conditioning still whisper, "Don't say no. Don't disappoint. Don't risk being disliked." These voices are the inner tyrants, born from years of projection. They are the narcissist within. To awaken, the empath must confront not only the outer manipulator, but also the inner one, the part of themselves that equates sacrifice with love and silence with safety. This battle is brutal. It strips away illusions of purity. The empath, who once saw themselves as harmless, begins to realize they too have used giving as a form of control, hoping their sacrifice would buy them love, hoping their endurance would purchase belonging. And here lies the paradox. By facing their shadow honestly, the empath reclaims their wholeness. Jung said the shadow, once confronted, ceases to rule us unconsciously. And so each act of awareness becomes a step out of bondage and into freedom. The empath's healing does not begin in denial of their shadow, but in its embrace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the empath begins to practice a new stance toward life. They pause before giving. They feel the impulse to rescue and ask, "Is this love, or is this fear?" They begin to notice that love without freedom is not love at all, but bondage. And with each pause, each question, the ground beneath them shifts. This is when the unconscious begins to speak louder. The empath's dreams change. Perhaps they dream of wandering through vast houses, opening hidden rooms they never knew existed. Perhaps they descend into caves where mysterious figures whisper riddles. These are not random images, they are symbols of the psyche pointing toward the forgotten parts of the soul. Here Jung's great archetypes stir, anima and animus, the inner feminine and inner masculine. For many empaths, these forces are distorted. The feminine silenced, mistaken for endless self-sacrifice. The masculine banished, mistaken for cruelty and domination. But in the dream world they return, demanding recognition. The anima may appear as a woman cloaked in mystery, urging the empath to trust their intuition, to honor their inner knowing. The animus may appear as a stern guide, teaching courage, insisting on boundaries, reminding them that strength is not the enemy of love. Both arrive not to harm but to restore balance. The empath begins to sense that true wholeness requires both, the softness that feels and the fire that protects. To embrace intuition without losing strength. To wield courage without abandoning tenderness. This integration dissolves the old split. No longer prey, no longer predator, but something new. The narcissist feels this shift. Their once reliable supply of validation begins to dry. The mirror they used to admire themselves starts to crack. And so they resist. They rage. They accuse. But this time the empath does not collapse. Their voice, though trembling, rises. I am here. I exist. I matter. This is not war. It is birth. The birth of the true self. The breaking point arrives like a storm. The empath, once a mirror for everyone else's needs, finally shatters. Years of silence, years of bending, years of swallowing pain collapse into a single cry from the soul. Enough. This word is terrifying. It feels selfish, dangerous, even violent. And yet it is sacred. Because in that single refusal, the empath declares their existence. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the empath, this enough is the moment fate cracks open. It is the unconscious becoming conscious. The narcissist, sensing the shift, thrashes harder. They rage, they manipulate, they plead. But the empath, though trembling, does not fold. Something deeper anchors them now. A strength they never knew they carried. A strength born not of domination but of alignment. And in this strength, clarity floods in. They see that their suffering was never meaningless, it was initiation. They see that every wound carried them to this threshold, every betrayal forced them to look inward, every shadow revealed the truth. They were never meant to be a vessel for another's void. They were meant to be a soul, whole and luminous, walking their own path. Tears come, not of despair but of release. The empath begins to grieve not just the narcissist, but the self they abandoned for so long. And in the grief they feel rebirth. For the first time they are not living as reflection but as reality. Not as prey but as presence. Not as silence but as voice. If these words stir something in you, don't let it pass. Subscribe now and share your journey in the comments. Not for me but for you, and for the countless others who need to know they are not alone. If this message touched your heart, it's because you are ready for more. Freedom at first feels strange. After years of captivity, silence does not feel like peace. It feels like emptiness. The empath wonders, who am I without the role of healer, giver, rescuer? For so long, identity was defined by the needs of others. Without those chains, the self feels naked, almost fragile. But this fragility is not weakness. It is birth. Jung called this the night sea journey, a passage through darkness where the old self dies and the new self has not yet fully formed. Many turn back here, seduced by the false comfort of old patterns. But those who endure discover something extraordinary. The silence that once felt like exile becomes a space where the soul can finally breathe. The empath begins to notice subtle shifts. Laughter arises not as performance but as release. Solitude, once unbearable, now feels like sanctuary. They no longer rush to fill silence with apologies or to mend discomfort with sacrifice. Instead, they sit in stillness and listen. And in that listening they hear their own voice, quiet, steady, and real. Dreams too begin to change. Where once there were endless chases and locked rooms, now rivers flow, doors open, light cracks through stone. The unconscious is signaling renewal, showing that beneath the rubble of the old identity lies an entire inner universe waiting to be explored. This is individuation in motion. Not the polished perfection of a mask, but the raw emergence of authenticity. The empath is no longer simply the gentle giver. They are no longer the shadowed victim. They are something more complex. Someone who can feel deeply and still stand firmly, someone who can love without losing themselves. And in this complexity lies their wholeness. The empath begins to sense it, a new life stirring, fragile but unshakable. Grief arrives like a tide. The empath does not only grieve the narcissist, they grieve themselves. They grieve the years of silence, the boundaries never spoken, the voice that stayed hidden. They grieve the innocence that believed love alone could save another, the tenderness that was twisted into servitude, the endless sacrifices offered on an altar that never gave anything back. These tears are sacred. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, the stripping away of illusion so that truth can be seen. To weep is to cleanse. To grieve is to honor the self that was abandoned for so long. And in this grief, the empath feels something unexpected: relief. For the first time, they see clearly. The narcissist was never the savior they hoped for, nor the wounded child they dreamed of healing. They were a mirror, a catalyst, a figure that forced the empath to see their own shadow. Painful, yes. Necessary, yes. But never destiny. The true transformation was never in fixing the narcissist. It was always in reclaiming themselves. And so, the empath begins to gather the fragments they scattered along the way. The forgotten passions. The silenced rage. The long-denied need for reciprocity. One by one, these pieces return, not as flaws to be hidden but as parts of a whole self coming alive again. The narcissist fades in importance. Not erased, not denied, but placed in perspective. They were a chapter, not the book. A storm, not the sky. The empath begins to understand. The fire that burned in anguish is the same fire that now lights the path forward. And with this realization, the empath steps into a new kind of power, not the power to control others but the power to be fully themselves. The empath walks differently now. Each step feels more deliberate, each breath more grounded. They no longer shrink to make others comfortable, nor do they betray themselves to preserve a fragile peace. Instead, they carry their shadow beside them, not as an enemy but as a companion, a reminder of their depth. For the first time, they begin to practice discernment. They learn that not all intensity is love. Not all charisma is depth. Not all need is truth. They sense with clarity what belongs to them and what does not. Where once they absorbed every sorrow like a sponge, now they let others carry their own burdens. This distance is not coldness, it is respect. Respect for their own journey and respect for the journeys of others. Compassion changes shape. No longer compulsive, no longer driven by guilt or fear of abandonment, it becomes steady and strong. They can sit with another's pain without drowning in it. They can witness another's rage without becoming its target. They can feel deeply without erasing themselves. And in this new stance, love itself transforms. It is no longer the desperate pact between giver and taker, shadow and shadow. It is something freer, quieter, stronger. Love that does not enslave but liberates. Love that does not cost the soul but nourishes it. The narcissist, should they still linger, feels the fracture. Their tactics falter, their control weakens, their mask slips. For the empath no longer plays the role. They no longer provide the endless supply of attention, validation, and sacrifice. The dance is broken. This is not revenge, it is release. The empath sees clearly. The narcissist is not an enemy to destroy, nor a child to save, but a symbol. A reminder of what happens when the shadow is denied, when the persona consumes the self. And with that clarity, peace begins to take root. Individuation is not perfection, it is wholeness. The empath begins to see this truth reflected in their daily life. They laugh differently now, not as a mask but as release. They sit in solitude without fear, discovering the richness of their own company. They no longer rush to apologize for existing, nor do they offer love as a transaction. Their yes becomes real because it now stands beside an equally sacred no. Dreams confirm the shift. Images of rivers opening into seas, of locked doors swinging wide, of phoenixes rising from ash fill the night. These are not fantasies. They are messages from the unconscious, celebrating what the conscious mind is only beginning to grasp. Something new is being born. The empath explores neglected landscapes within. Passions buried for years resurface. The urge to create, to write, to paint, to sing, to dream. Desires once dismissed as selfish now feel sacred. To give form to the self is no longer indulgence. It is survival. Each act of creation becomes a ritual of reclamation, a way of calling the scattered fragments of the soul back home. Relationships shift. Some fall away, unable to adapt to this new strength. Others deepen, nourished by authenticity. New connections arise, not drawn to the mask of selflessness, but to the reality of a whole, complex human being. This is the alchemy Jung spoke of, transformation through integration. The empath is no longer just the giver, no longer only the wounded. They are both and more. They are a conscious soul, aware of their light and their shadow, their strength and their vulnerability. This balance is fragile, yes, but it is real. And in it lies the seed of a new life. The empath now stands at a crossroads. The old life calls with familiar chains, whispering promises of safety. The new life beckons with freedom, but also with uncertainty. Jung described this as the tension of opposites, the tearing between who we were and who we are called to become. At times, the pull backward feels overwhelming. The critic's voice returns, echoing with the words of the narcissist, "You are selfish. You are ungrateful. You will end up alone." But something has changed. The empath recognizes these words as ghosts, not truths. And with that recognition, they choose differently. This choice is not loud. It is quiet, steady, repeated daily. To set a boundary. To rest without guilt. To speak without trembling. Each choice becomes a brick in the foundation of the true self. The narcissist no longer defines the empath's world. Instead, the empath defines themselves. They begin to sense a deeper truth. They were never broken. They were simply unclaimed. And now they are coming home. If this message resonates, pause here. Breathe. Reflect. And if you feel that spark of recognition, that maybe this is your story too, subscribe and share your thoughts below. Not because I ask, but because your story may be the light someone else is waiting for. The empath's journey is not only personal, it is universal. And every voice matters in this awakening. With new strength comes new perception. The empath begins to see that life was never simply happening to them, it was happening through them. Every betrayal, every shadow, every wound was part of a larger unfolding. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness guiding the psyche toward integration. The self is not flattery. It does not shame or demand. It simply is, vast, timeless, unshaken. To touch it, even for a moment, is to feel both humbled and empowered. The empath realizes they are not just a role, not just a wound, not just a survivor of narcissists. They are part of something larger, the lifelong dialogue between conscious and unconscious, shadow and light. This realization shifts their relationship with suffering. Pain is no longer punishment. It becomes teacher. Loneliness is no longer exile. It becomes space for communion with the self. Even conflict is no longer terror, but opportunity, an invitation to practice presence, to practice truth. The empath's compassion also transforms. It expands, no longer chained to sacrifice. They can see the narcissist not as enemy, nor as savior, but as a mirror of what happens when the shadow is denied. They feel compassion without losing themselves, care without collapse. And so, the empath walks not with bitterness, but with clarity. The chains have broken. And in their place is freedom, not just from another, but from the illusions that once bound their soul. Yet freedom is not final. It must be practiced day after day. The echoes of the past still whisper. The empath still feels guilt when they say no, still feels the urge to rescue when they see someone suffer, still longs at times for the false safety of old roles. But this time they do not collapse. They notice the voices. They acknowledge the urges. And then, consciously, they choose differently. This is individuation in action, not perfection but awareness. Not the erasure of shadow but its integration. Dreams continue to guide the process. Where once the empath dreamed of being chased or trapped, now they dream of guidance. Ancient figures offering keys. Mountains calling them upward. Animals once feared now walking calmly beside them. The unconscious affirms, the work of descent has birthed descent. The darkness has indeed carried the seed of light. And in waking life the empath feels it. They speak more directly. They risk being disliked. They honor themselves even when others disapprove. And each time they do, the world does not collapse. Instead, it reshapes, creating space for authenticity. This is purification. Not everyone will remain. But those who do will meet the empath as an equal, not as a mirror for their own hunger. The empath is no longer defined by sacrifice. They are defined by choice. Something unexpected happens here. Gratitude. Not for the narcissist's cruelty, but for the resilience born from despair. For the clarity born from deception. For the wholeness born of fragmentation. The empath realizes that without the wound, they might never have sought deeper healing. Without the shadow, they might never have discovered their light. The very suffering that once threatened to annihilate them has become the soil of their transformation. This is Jung's paradox. The very things we flee from are the things that save us, if only we dare to face them. The empath now lives with reverence. They understand that every descent carries a seed of ascent. Every shadow conceals a fragment of light. Every wound opens into healing. Life is not punishment nor random chaos. It is a dialogue. Consciousness speaking with the unconscious, guiding the soul toward wholeness. And with this reverence comes peace. Not the shallow peace of silence, but the deep peace of authenticity. To stand in one's truth, to honor one's boundaries, to embrace one's shadow and light alike, that is peace. The empath has begun to live not as a victim of life, but as a participant in its unfolding. Rebirth does not arrive as fireworks. It arrives quietly, like dawn breaking after a long night. The empath feels it in the way sunlight touches a leaf, in the rhythm of their breath, in the laughter that rises without performance. These small moments, once invisible in survival, now feel sacred. They begin to sense new desires, authentic ones. To create. To explore. To connect with others not through sacrifice but through reciprocity. At first this feels strange. Love without struggle feels unreal to someone who has lived in endless giving. But slowly they learn, love can be tender and free, vulnerable and strong. Relationships blossom differently now. The empath attracts those who resonate with authenticity and repels those who only fed on silence. This is not loss. It is alignment. Even the narcissist, should they reappear, cannot find the same hold. Their words may sting, but they no longer enslave. Their tactics may provoke, but they no longer dominate. The empath sees them clearly, not as destiny but as a warning, a living symbol of what happens when the shadow consumes the self. In this clarity, compassion remains, but without entanglement. They can care without collapsing, love without losing, give without erasing. This is transformation. Not escape but awakening. The empath now carries themselves with quiet authority. Not the authority of dominance but of authenticity. They no longer beg to be heard. Their very presence speaks. They no longer try to prove their worth. Their being is enough. This changes everything. The narcissist fades not because they vanished but because the empath outgrew the role. What once felt like destiny now feels like a closed chapter. What remains is not bitterness but freedom. And this freedom is not simply the absence of chains, it is the presence of possibility. For the first time the empath asks, what do I want to create? The question feels both terrifying and exhilarating. For so long life was reaction. Now it can be creation. Jung described individuation as the privilege of a lifetime, to become who you truly are. The empath feels this truth now, not as theory but as lived experience. Every shadow faced, every tear shed, every illusion shattered has led them here, to the threshold of themselves. And so they step forward. Not as mirror. Not as martyr. Not as prey. But as a whole human being carrying both shadow and light, ready to live with depth, presence and freedom. The journey is not over, it never is. Individuation is lifelong, a rhythm of descent and ascent, shadow and light. But the empath no longer fears the rhythm. They trust it. Even when suffering returns, they know it carries meaning. Even when shadows surface, they know it conceals light. This trust changes their relationship with fear. They no longer dread abandonment, rejection, or disapproval. They know their worth is not bound to others' acceptance, but rooted in their own alignment. Dreams continue to guide. Fires once consuming now warm. Animals once threatening now guide. Corridors once endless now open into vast landscapes. The unconscious affirms the journey, the self is unfolding. The empath's compassion radiates outward. Not the desperate glow of someone needing to be needed, but the steady flame of someone who has come home to themselves. This light does not burn out because it is not fueled by sacrifice, it is fueled by wholeness. Others notice. They feel safer in the empath's presence. Not because the empath will carry their wounds, but because the empath embodies integration. And wholeness is contagious. The empath has become not a savior, not a victim, but a mirror of possibility, a living testament that suffering, when faced, transforms into strength. Looking back, the empath sees the path clearly. What once felt like endless punishment now reveals itself as initiation. The narcissists were not teachers, not enemies, not fate. They were catalysts. Painful, yes, but necessary. Without them, the empath might never have faced their shadow. Without the shadow, they might never have found their light. This perspective brings closure without bitterness. The empath does not seek revenge. They do not need to expose or destroy. Their healing no longer depends on the narcissist's downfall. The only task now is to live fully, authentically as themselves. They carry their scars not as shame but as symbols. Symbols of resilience. Proof that the soul can endure the fire and emerge not only alive but radiant. And so they step forward with reverence. Life is no longer something to survive. It is something to participate in. Something to co-create with. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath now understands. To have been surrounded by narcissists was to be forced into darkness. But in that darkness they discovered themselves. And that discovery is priceless. The story does not end here. It never does. Individuation is not a destination but a journey, a constant unfolding of self, a dialogue between light and shadow. The empath knows now that more challenges will come. More shadows will rise. More pain will press against the soul. But they are no longer afraid. They have learned the rhythm. They have seen that every descent carries the seed of ascent. Every shadow conceals a fragment of light. Every wound, when faced, becomes a doorway to healing. And so they walk forward, no longer as a mirror for others, no longer as prey for narcissists, but as a soul alive with depth. They walk not to escape suffering, but to let suffering transform them. They walk not to find perfection, but to embrace wholeness. This is the true gift of the empath's journey. Not escape, but awakening. Not illusion, but authenticity. Not silence, but voice. The empath stands now as a reminder to all who listen. Your sensitivity is not weakness. Your suffering is not meaningless. And your shadow is not your enemy. Each is part of the same sacred process, the process of becoming who you truly are. And if you are listening to this and feel a spark within, remember, your story is not over. You are still becoming. And the journey, as painful as it may be, is leading you home. The empath begins to notice something remarkable. The world responds differently to them now. Where once they attracted takers, manipulators, and those hungry for control, they now draw people who mirror their authenticity. Wholeness attracts wholeness, just as illusion attracts illusion. At first, this feels unfamiliar. Love without struggle seems unreal. Peace without sacrifice feels suspicious. But slowly, the empath learns to trust it. They learn that connection can be built on reciprocity, not consumption. That presence can feel safe without being suffocating. That love can be both tender and free. This new way of relating requires courage. The empath must resist the urge to slip back into old roles, to overgive, to bend until they break. Each time they catch themselves, they pause and breathe. Each pause is a victory. Each choice to stay authentic is another thread in the tapestry of freedom. And the narcissist, once the central figure of their life, becomes nothing more than a shadow at the edge of memory. Not forgotten, but no longer defining. Their power is broken because the empath has changed the only thing the narcissist truly fed on, the belief that the empath's worth was negotiable. This is the triumph Jung pointed toward, not victory over another, but victory over unconsciousness. The empath now lives awake, aware, and aligned. In this new awareness, the empath discovers joy in the smallest places. Sunlight streaming through a window. A breath taken slowly without rush. The sound of laughter that rises from the belly, unforced. These moments, once lost in survival, now feel radiant. They realize that life was never meant to be a constant battlefield. It was meant to be lived, savored, and explored. The narcissists of the past tried to convince them that love meant sacrifice, that worth meant servitude, that survival meant silence. But now the empath knows the truth. Love is freedom. Worth is inherent. Survival is only the beginning. Living is the real journey. And so, they create. They write, paint, build, dance. They pour their soul into forms that reflect their essence. Creation becomes communion with the self, the sacred dialogue between inner and outer, shadow and light. Dreams mirror this blossoming. No longer haunted by pursuit or entrapment, the empath dreams of landscapes opening wide, of doors leading to fields of light, of rivers flowing into seas. The unconscious affirms, the journey is no longer just survival. It is expansion. And in this expansion, the empath learns the greatest lesson of all. Their sensitivity was never weakness. It was the seed of transformation. The empath begins to embody something rare, compassion rooted in strength. They can sit with another's pain without dissolving into it. They can listen to another's rage without becoming its target. They can care deeply without erasing themselves. This new compassion radiates outward. Friends feel it. Family senses it. Strangers are drawn to it. Not because the empath offers to carry their wounds, but because the empath now embodies presence, wholeness. And presence, unlike sacrifice, never runs dry. Jung taught that individuation is not the denial of shadow but its integration. The empath feels this truth. Their rage, once buried, now fuels their courage. Their grief, once silenced, now deepens their compassion. Their shadow, once feared, now guides them toward authenticity. Even when old echoes resurface, when guilt whispers, when fear rises, when the urge to bend returns, the empath does not collapse. They notice. They breathe. They choose differently. And each time they do, they reinforce the foundation of their freedom. This is the essence of transformation, not perfection but practice. Not erasing the past but using it as the soil from which something new can grow. The empath now looks back with new eyes. The years of pain, once unbearable, reveal themselves as necessary steps in an initiation. They see that without the narcissist's hunger, they might never have faced their silence. Without their silence, they might never have discovered their voice. This perspective brings peace. Not the shallow peace of forgetting, but the deep peace of understanding. They do not excuse the harm done, but they no longer carry it as a chain. They honor the scars as symbols of survival, proof of resilience, reminders of a soul that refused to die. And in this peace, gratitude blooms. Gratitude for the resilience born of suffering. Gratitude for the strength discovered in shadows. Gratitude for the clarity that only darkness could provide. Carl Jung once said, "There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." The empath feels this truth in their bones. They are not flawless, not untouchable, not immune to pain. But they are whole. Whole enough to live. Whole enough to love. Whole enough to be. And that wholeness, fragile yet eternal, is the greatest victory of all. The empath begins to see life itself as a mirror. Every encounter, every relationship, every shadow is part of a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious. Jung called this the process of individuation, the slow, steady becoming of the self. And so, when new challenges arise, the empath no longer collapses into despair. Instead, they ask, what is this teaching me about myself? What shadow is asking to be seen? The shift changes everything. Pain is no longer meaningless. Fear is no longer a prison. Both become teachers. In the past, the empath lived as a mirror polished smooth to reflect others' needs. Now they are no longer only a reflection. They are substance, depth, presence. They carry themselves with quiet authority, the kind that comes not from domination but from authenticity. Others notice. Some are drawn closer. Others fall away. This too is part of individuation, the pruning of illusions to make space for truth. The empath no longer fears loss. They understand that what falls away was never theirs to hold. And in this clarity they discover joy, not the frantic joy of being needed, but the quiet joy of simply existing. A joy that cannot be stolen because it is rooted not in others, but in the soul itself. At night, dreams become oracles. The empath dreams of climbing mountains, of crossing rivers, of entering temples filled with light. These are not random images. They are symbols of integration, the psyche affirming that the soul has stepped into a new stage of becoming. In waking life, this integration shows itself in small acts of courage. The empath says no without trembling. They rest without apology. They speak truth without disguising it in softness. Each act, though ordinary, is revolutionary. Because each act declares, I exist. I matter. I am whole. The narcissist, whether near or far, loses their grip entirely. Their power was never in their cruelty, it was in the empath's silence. And now that silence has become voice. Now that compliance has become clarity. Now that fear has become strength. This shift radiates outward. Friends feel safer. Family sees boundaries they never expected. Strangers sense presence that requires no performance. The empath has become a mirror of possibility, a living reminder that suffering can be transformed into strength. And in this transformation, the empath carries a new responsibility: to live authentically, to honor the truth of their being, to embody the integration that once seemed impossible. Looking back, the empath no longer sees only pain. They see a story, messy, raw, but sacred. A story of descent into shadow, of confrontation with silence, of awakening through fire. And they understand, the suffering was not wasted. It was the very soil in which their authenticity took root. They also see clearly what once blinded them. They remember the illusions, the belief that love could save the narcissist, the belief that silence was safety, the belief that sacrifice was virtue. These illusions are gone, dissolved in the light of awareness. And in their place, a new vision emerges. Love is no longer desperation, it is freedom. Compassion is no longer compulsion, it is choice. Empathy is no longer slavery, it is strength. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The empath now sees how true this is. For years, unconscious patterns ruled them, pulling them back into chains. But now, with awareness, they no longer call it fate. They call it choice. And in that choice they find liberation. The empath learns the rhythm of freedom. It is not static, it is alive, a daily practice. Some days shadows return. Old fears whisper. Old urges to bend reappear. But now the empath does not collapse. They breathe. They choose. They stand. This is the essence of individuation, not perfection but conscious practice. To feel the old wound and still choose differently. To hear the old voice and still honor the new truth. To live not as a prisoner of the past, but as a participant in the unfolding of the soul. Relationships reflect this shift. No longer entangled in toxic cycles, the empath attracts connections built on reciprocity, honesty, and respect. These connections may be fewer, but they are real. And real is enough. The empath also discovers solitude as sacred. Once feared, solitude now becomes sanctuary, a place where the soul speaks clearly, where creativity flows, where presence deepens. They realize they no longer need others to complete them. They are already whole. And from this wholeness, love flows, not the desperate giving of the past, but the authentic offering of a soul unafraid to be itself. Now the empath embodies the paradox of transformation. They are both scarred and radiant, both broken and whole, both fragile and unshakable. Their scars are not erased but carried as symbols, reminders that they endured the fire and emerged alive. They see the narcissist differently now. Not as an enemy, not as a savior, but as a mirror of what happens when shadow is denied. This recognition brings peace. No need for revenge. No need for validation. The narcissist has already played their role in the story. They forced the empath to awaken. That is enough. And so, the empath turns fully toward life. They reclaim joy in small things, create from the depths of their soul, connect authentically, and live without apology. They understand that individuation is never complete. It is an endless process of becoming. But they no longer fear this process. They embrace it. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath now knows this truth intimately. To have been surrounded by narcissists was to be pushed into darkness. But in that darkness they found themselves. And that discovery is the true gift of their journey. The empath begins to live with a new kind of courage. Not the loud courage of warriors, but the quiet courage of someone who refuses to betray themselves again. Each boundary spoken, each truth declared, each silence honored becomes an act of bravery. They understand now that courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means choosing alignment even in the presence of fear. Fear still whispers yes, but it no longer dictates. The empath hears it, acknowledges it, and continues forward. This shift changes how they experience conflict. In the past, conflict meant terror. It meant bending, apologizing, erasing themselves to restore peace. Now, conflict becomes opportunity. An invitation to remain authentic even when others disapprove. And with each opportunity, the empath grows steadier. Others may call them selfish. Others may accuse them of changing. And in a way they are right. The empath has changed. They have shifted from erasure to presence, from compliance to authenticity. What once looked like kindness was often silence. Now kindness wears the face of truth. And in this truth, the empath discovers a deeper form of love. Love that does not betray the self. Love that does not demand sacrifice as proof. Love that allows both people to stand whole, side by side. This is the love they were searching for all along. Dreams continue to guide the journey. The empath dreams of phoenixes rising, rivers merging into seas, and hidden rooms opening within vast houses. These are symbols of integration, signs that the psyche is celebrating the unification of shadow and light. The empath now walks in a different rhythm. Life no longer feels like a battlefield of survival, but a dialogue with the soul. Shadows arise, yes, but they are met with curiosity, not fear. Pain returns, yes, but it is met with reverence, not despair. Carl Jung taught that the unconscious is not an enemy but a guide. The empath has learned this truth. Where once they feared the darkness within, now they lean into it, listening for its messages, trusting its symbols. Each descent becomes an initiation. Each ascent becomes renewal. Relationships mirror this rhythm. Toxic patterns no longer hold appeal. Manipulative games no longer seduce. Instead, the empath gravitates toward authenticity, reciprocity, and depth. They discover that true intimacy is not born from erasure, but from presence. Two whole beings standing together, not one devoured while the other is enthroned. This realization reshapes their definition of love. Love is no longer a bargain, no longer a desperate attempt to heal another's emptiness. Love is now a meeting of equals, a communion of souls that honors individuality as much as connection. And in this new love, the empath feels what they always longed for: freedom. Looking back, the empath marvels at the journey. What once felt like endless torment has become sacred transformation. The narcissists who once drained them are no longer monsters in memory, they are symbols, reminders of what happens when shadow rules unchecked. This perspective brings compassion without entanglement. The empath sees clearly: the narcissist is not evil incarnate, but a soul trapped in denial of their own darkness. This does not excuse harm, but it explains it. And with understanding comes release. The empath no longer needs revenge. They no longer crave validation. They no longer carry bitterness. They carry wisdom instead. Wisdom that suffering, when faced consciously, becomes strength. Wisdom that shadow, when embraced, becomes guide. Wisdom that sensitivity, when honored, becomes gift. This wisdom radiates. Others sense it. They may not know the details of the empath's past, but they feel the presence of someone who has endured, integrated, and awakened. And that presence itself becomes healing, a silent invitation for others to face their own shadows. The empath, once devoured by another's hunger, now becomes a lighthouse. Not by effort, not by striving, but simply by being. Standing in this new light, the empath finally understands. Their story was never about escaping darkness. It was about allowing darkness to transform them. The narcissist was not the end of the story. They were the beginning, the push that forced the empath into the fire where their true self was forged. The empath is no longer naive. They no longer confuse sacrifice with love, silence with kindness, or erasure with nobility. They know their worth cannot be measured by how much they endure. Their worth is intrinsic, unshakable, eternal. And with this knowing, they begin to live fully. They laugh without fear. They create without apology. They love without chains. They exist not as reflection but as reality, not as prey but as presence. Carl Jung said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." The empath now embodies this. They are not only light, not only shadow, but both. Not only soft, not only strong, but both. Not only broken, not only whole, but both. This is individuation. This is freedom. This is the gift hidden in suffering. The empath's life now feels like a spiral rather than a straight line. Old wounds still echo, shadows still surface, but each time they return, the empath meets them from a higher vantage point. What once destroyed them now refines them. What once silenced them now strengthens their voice. This spiral is the rhythm of individuation. Jung described it as a lifelong dance between the conscious and the unconscious, a dialogue that never ends. For the empath, this means accepting that the journey is not about erasing pain but transforming it, not about escaping shadow but integrating it. And so, when guilt resurfaces, they listen without collapsing. When fear whispers, they acknowledge it without surrendering. When the urge to bend arises, they pause, breathe, and choose differently. Each choice reinforces freedom. Each act of awareness deepens wholeness. Others notice the difference. Some resist it, clinging to the old version of the empath who bent without question. But those who value authenticity remain, and new relationships emerge, connections built not on need but on reciprocity, not on performance but on presence. The empath's world is smaller now, perhaps, but infinitely richer, because it is real. In solitude, the empath rediscovers themselves. The silence that once felt suffocating now feels expansive. In that space, they meet parts of themselves long ignored, desires, passions, voices that had been silenced under years of servitude. They realize that solitude is not loneliness, it is communion. Communion with the self, with creativity, with life itself. They write, they paint, they wander, they imagine. These acts are not distractions. They are reclamations. Each act of creation is the soul saying, "I am here. I am alive." And in this aliveness, the empath discovers joy not tied to another's approval. Joy that rises uninvited, joy that cannot be stolen. This joy is fragile, yes, but it is also enduring because it flows from authenticity. The narcissist's voice may still echo faintly, but it no longer dominates. Their demands may resurface in memory, but they no longer control. For the empath has found a stronger voice within, the voice of the self, steady and unshaken. This voice does not shout. It whispers. And yet, its whisper is louder than any scream from the past. The empath's compassion, once entangled with compulsion, has matured. They can care without collapsing. They can love without losing themselves. They can give without erasing. This new compassion radiates outward like a steady flame. Friends feel it. Family notices it. Even strangers sense it. Not because the empath bends endlessly, but because they embody wholeness. And wholeness, once felt, is unforgettable. Carl Jung spoke of the self as the center that unites opposites. The empath now lives this truth. Their tenderness does not cancel their strength. Their rage does not destroy their compassion. Their shadow does not negate their light. They carry it all, and in carrying it they are free. And this freedom changes their relationships. They no longer attract those who feed on silence. Instead, they attract those who honor reciprocity, depth, and presence. For authenticity calls forth authenticity, just as illusion once called forth illusion. The empath has become a lighthouse. Not by trying, not by striving, but simply by being. Their presence says more than their words ever could. It is possible to walk through darkness and come out whole. Looking back, the empath no longer asks, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead they ask, "What did this awaken in me?" And the answer is clear: resilience, clarity, authenticity, wholeness. The narcissists of the past were catalysts, painful, yes, but necessary. Without them, the empath might never have confronted their silence. Without their silence, they might never have discovered their voice. This perspective dissolves the need for revenge or validation. The empath does not need to prove anything to anyone. They do not need to expose or destroy. Their healing is not dependent on another's downfall. Their healing has already happened within. And so they walk forward with reverence. They carry their scars not as shame but as symbols. They carry their story not as burden but as testament. They live not as reflection but as reality. They understand now that individuation is not about becoming flawless, it is about becoming whole. And in that wholeness they finally taste freedom. The empath's journey culminates not in escape, but in transformation. They were forced into darkness, yes. They were broken open by suffering, yes. But in that breaking they found themselves. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath knows this now, not as an idea but as lived truth. To have been surrounded by narcissists was to be stripped of illusions. To lose themselves was to discover themselves. To walk through shadow was to awaken the light within. And so, they live differently now. They laugh freely. They create boldly. They love authentically. They walk forward carrying both shadow and light, both pain and joy, both fragility and strength. The narcissist's role in their story has ended. The empath is no longer prey, no longer mirror, no longer martyr. They are whole. They are real. They are free. And their story is far from over. For individuation is endless. But now they walk that path with courage, knowing that every descent carries a seed of ascent, every shadow conceals a fragment of light, and every wound opens into healing. This is not the end. This is the beginning. The empath no longer seeks to erase the past. They honor it. Each memory, each scar, each broken night becomes part of their sacred story. To deny it would be to deny the very soil that birthed their transformation. Carl Jung taught that wholeness requires imperfection. The empath understands this now. They do not strive to be flawless, untouchable, or endlessly strong. They allow themselves to be vulnerable, to feel, to stumble. And in that vulnerability lies their true strength. They realize that the shadow never disappears. It walks beside them always. But instead of fearing it, they embrace it. Shadow is no longer enemy, it is guide. Each time it rises, it points toward something unhealed, something waiting to be integrated. And in integration they become more themselves. This acceptance changes everything. No more battles against the self. No more wars within. They live in dialogue, with their fear, their grief, their rage, their tenderness. Each has a place at the table of their soul. And in this acceptance they discover peace. Not the fragile peace of silence, but the deep peace of wholeness. The empath begins to share their story. At first, quietly, with a friend, a journal, a canvas. Then, more boldly, with communities, with strangers, with the world. Not to seek pity, not to seek validation, but to offer light. Their story becomes testimony, proof that survival is possible, that transformation is real, that suffering can be turned into strength. And in sharing it, they discover something unexpected. Their story is not just their own. Others recognize themselves in it. Others feel less alone. Others find courage to face their own shadows. This is the ripple effect of individuation. When one person integrates, they create space for others to do the same. Wholeness spreads, not through preaching but through presence. The empath becomes a living reminder: you do not have to stay broken. You do not have to remain silent. You do not have to live enslaved to shadows. Healing is possible. Wholeness is possible. Freedom is possible. And so, their journey becomes more than personal. It becomes collective. The empath now lives with a new kind of reverence. They see life not as punishment, but as initiation. Every trial is a teacher. Every descent is a doorway. Every shadow is a guide. This reverence brings gratitude. Gratitude not for the cruelty they endured, but for the resilience born from it. Gratitude not for the silence, but for the voice that rose from it. Gratitude not for the darkness itself, but for the light it revealed. They carry this gratitude into every moment. A walk beneath the sky feels sacred. A conversation with a friend feels profound. Even solitude feels holy, because they know how easily these things can be stolen, and how powerful it is to reclaim them. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The empath has done this. They did not escape their darkness. They entered it, faced it, integrated it, and in doing so they discovered their own light. This is the essence of their awakening. The empath no longer measures life in terms of avoidance, avoiding conflict, avoiding abandonment, avoiding rejection. They measure it in terms of presence, being here fully with all that is. They understand now that suffering will return. Shadows will rise again. But they do not dread it. They trust it. Because each return is not punishment, it is invitation. Invitation to deepen, to integrate, to expand. This trust gives them freedom. They are no longer enslaved by fear of what might come. They are no longer paralyzed by memories of what has been. They live here now in the unfolding moment. Relationships, once traps, now become spaces of growth. Solitude, once prison, now becomes sanctuary. Shadow, once terror, now becomes guide. The empath has not escaped their humanity. They have embraced it. And in that embrace they have discovered something larger, the self, vast and unshaken, guiding them always toward wholeness. This is the treasure hidden in suffering, not escape but awakening. As the empath steps fully into their new life, they realize the truth. Their sensitivity was never the curse. It was always the key. What once made them prey now makes them powerful. What once silenced them now gives them voice. What once shattered them now holds them whole. Carl Jung's wisdom echoes, "The wound is where the light enters." The empath understands this now with every fiber of their being. Without the wound they would never have sought healing. Without the shadow they would never have found light. Without the suffering they would never have become whole. And so, they no longer hide their scars. They no longer apologize for their sensitivity. They no longer diminish their voice. They stand as they are, scarred, sensitive, whole, alive. Their story is not about narcissists. It is not about cruelty. It is about transformation. It is about the soul's ability to turn darkness into light, wounds into wisdom, silence into song. And that story is not only theirs. It is ours. The empath now understands that their life is not defined by what was taken, but by what was found. They were surrounded by narcissists, yes. They were broken down, yes. But in that breaking they uncovered something indestructible, their self. This realization is not just intellectual, it is embodied. They feel it in their breath, in their choices, in the steady rhythm of their days. Each moment lived authentically becomes proof. They are no longer prey, no longer prisoner, no longer silent. As they continue forward, the empath carries a new mission, not imposed but chosen. To live authentically. To create boldly. To love freely. And in doing so, to become a mirror of possibility for others. Their presence whispers, "You can survive. You can heal. You can awaken." They do not need to preach or convince. Their very being tells the story. This is the ripple effect of transformation. One healed soul becomes a spark for others. One voice that breaks silence inspires another to speak. One act of authenticity grants permission for another to do the same. And so, the empath's journey, once marked by isolation, becomes connection. They find themselves surrounded not by takers and manipulators, but by fellow travelers, souls also walking the path of individuation, also facing their shadows, also discovering their light. Together they weave a new story. A story not of chains but of freedom. Not of silence but of voice. Not of narcissists but of wholeness. And this story is still being written. Looking back, the empath sees clearly, the narcissist never truly had power. Their control was borrowed, fed by the empath's silence, sustained by the empath's self-erasure. The moment the empath reclaimed their worth, the narcissist's power dissolved like smoke. This truth is liberating. It means the empath was never powerless. They were always capable of awakening. It simply took time, courage, and the breaking of illusions to see it. Carl Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." The empath embodies this now. They are not defined by cruelty, not defined by suffering, not defined by scars. They are defined by choice, by the decision to turn pain into wisdom, shadow into light, silence into song. And so, their life becomes testimony, you are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to create from it. This realization is the final gift of their journey, and it changes everything. The empath reaches the climax of their journey, integration. They are no longer only giver or victim, no longer only light or shadow, no longer only fragile or strong. They are all of it held together in wholeness. This integration is not static. It breathes, it evolves, it continues, but it is real. And in it lies freedom. They laugh now not because they are untouched by sorrow but because they have lived through it. They create now not to prove worth but because creation itself is joy. They love now not to rescue or be rescued but to walk side by side as equals. Their scars remain, yes. But scars are not signs of weakness, they are signs of survival. They are proof that the fire burned but did not consume. And so the empath walks forward, not flawless but whole. Not untouched but unbroken. Not silenced but alive. This is individuation. This is transformation. This is the gift of the journey. The story closes but the journey continues. The empath, once surrounded by narcissists, now walks free, not because the world changed but because they did. They carry within them the wisdom of shadow, the strength of survival, the light of awakening. Their life becomes a living reminder. Sensitivity is not weakness. Shadow is not enemy. Suffering is not meaningless. Each is part of the sacred process of becoming who you truly are. So if you are listening now and feel a spark in your soul, if you recognize yourself in this story, remember this: you are not powerless. You are not broken. You are not defined by what happened to you. You are defined by what you choose to become. And if this journey touched you, subscribe and share your voice below. Not for me, for you and for those still trapped in silence. Because your story might be the light someone else is waiting for. This is the gift of Carl Jung's wisdom. This is the gift of the empath's journey. And this is the beginning of yours.